Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the last IRIS seminar for this academic semester. My name is Alexandra Brankova, and I'm a PhD student here at IRIS, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. We're very excited to have opportunity to discuss a new volume published earlier in 2020, which sheds light on the use of civilization in Russian language political and media discourse, intellectual and academic production, and artistic practices. The title of the book is Russia as Civilization, Ideological Discourses in Politics, Media, and Academia, edited by Sanna Turma and Kore Johan Mjor, who are with us today. We also have two contributors, Olga Malinova and Viktor Schnirelman. Mark Bassin, Alicia Koranovic, and Matthew Blackburn kindly agreed to be discussants for today's seminar. And I'm personally looking forward the session today because I'm also referring to this book in my own research. So would like to kind of introduce the seminar format because it's a bit different than our previous seminars. So the seminar will be organized in three main parts. The editors will introduce the volume and present how it came about. So this would take about 13 minutes. Then Mark will comment on the volume. And the editors will have about 2-3 minutes to respond. Then we'll proceed to Olga's chapter titled Nation and Civilization as Templates for Russian Identity Construction, a historical overview, where Matthew Blackburn will comment on the chapter. And Olga will have time to answer. We'll take 10-15 minutes for questions from the audience. And then we'll proceed to the third part of the seminar, where Victor's chapter will be discussed by Alicia. The chapter is titled Russia's Between Civilization and a Civic Nation, Secular and Religious Uses of Civilizational Discourse During Putin's Third Term. And then in the end, we'll have about 15-20 minutes for discussing and having questions from the public again. So please feel free to write your questions throughout the seminar in the chat, or also you can raise your hand. The event would take between 1.5 hours and 2 hours. And before I give the floor to all our exciting speakers, I would just like to introduce each and every one very briefly. So Kore Johan Mjor is Associate Professor at Russian at the University of Bergen, Norway, and a Senior Research Librarian at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Sanna Turma is Professor of Russian Language and Cultural Studies at Tampere University. Mark Bassin is Professor at CBS and Sordetom University and Visiting Professor here at IRIS. Olga Malinova is Professor of Political Science and at the National Research University of Higher School of Economics, Moscow, and a Principal Research Fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow. Viktor Schnirelman is Senior Researcher in the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology, Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow. Alicia Koranovic is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. And last but not least, Matthew Blackburn is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Russian and Eurasian Studies here at Uppsala. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the introduction, Alexandra. I would like to start by thanking Matthew Blackburn for putting this event together. We were supposed to have, Kore Johan and I were supposed to have a book launch at the Alexandre conference in Helsinki last year, but for obvious reasons, the conference was postponed and the book launch was canceled. So this is actually the first time we have a chance to discuss this book with the public. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank Alicia Koranovic and Mark Bassin for agreeing this for agreeing to discuss the book, and also Viktor Schneiderman and Olga Malinova, who are two of our contributors and who will talk at this seminar today. And I'd like to thank all of our contributors. I hope you guys are online. I can't actually see who the participants are at the moment, but in general, thank you everyone for joining us. So I try to be really brief, just to tell you a few words about how this book came about and sort of what I think of it now and where I see things could go with this kind of civilizational studies. I guess it was 2014 when I personally first paid attention to the fact that the term civilization is becoming really predominant. Like, you know, you read any Russian text produced by the state actors, especially, you will see this word. And I paid particular attention, or this sort of caught my attention in 2014, and this was the presidential decree signed by President Vladimir Putin, ukaz about new cultural policy, where they used the term civilizationная самобытность. This is the civilizational originality that Russian cultural production was supposed to sort of express and enhance. And so, you know, this was when I started thinking, okay, the word has entered a legal text. This is pretty powerful. And at the time, at the Alexandria Institute, where I used to work, back then they had this rather large research project called Choices of Russia's Modernization, the director of which was Marko Kivinen, and I was in charge of this cultural studies cluster. And at the time, Kåre Johan happened to be a visiting fellow at Alexandria Institute. So this is how, you know, we started talking about it, and I thought that this topic would be relevant to that sort of big research project that was going on there. And also I thought it was a really, at the time, a current topic. So Kåre and I and Professor Oittinen, Vesa Oittinen, we put together a seminar, and some of the people who presented at that seminar, and I think it was in 2015, 6 years ago, Olga and Viktor were there. So some of the people who were at the seminar presenting a paper ended up contributing to the book. So that's how it came about. And so okay, so that's that story. So how I look at this book now, well, I would like to see it as a sort of what I would call representing critical civilizational studies. And I understand that people can throw the word, you know, people throw the word critical in front of almost anything. But by critical, I mean in the Russian area context, and in this particular context, first of all, an alternative to the institutionalized field of study that has emerged in Russia, in Russian academia over the last years. And this said, I am not familiar with all the academic production that these research clusters and journals and administrative units that go under the token of civilizational исследования, civilizational studies. So I'm not familiar with all of that academic production, obviously, but it is my understanding that as a rule, they do not necessarily promote a critical approach to the concept of civilization in the sense that I have in mind. And that is, what I have in mind is a critical analysis of the use of the term of civilization by state actors, by media, cultural, educational institutions in power. So this is how I see this civilizational discourse emerges, and this is what we're trying to kind of reconstruct, Kåre and I, in the introduction. So the critical analysis of the use of the term civilization, that is a critical analysis of the civilizational discourse, or discourses perhaps, entails a critique, in my opinion, a critique of the epistemological foundations of this concept, and also a critique of the political goals or agendas that people who produce this discourse may have in mind. So basically the ethos of the book is pretty similar to this research agenda that Henry Hale and Marlene Laruelle have recently advanced. and I like the way they talk about how they want to jettison the Huntingtonian baggage, by which I understand what they mean is that they want to kind of pursue a new kind of theoretical thinking around the term or the concept of civilization without the Huntingtonian baggage. And also they want to introduce a new research agenda where people would look, they want to sort of redirect attention away from the elite production of this civilizational discourse and pay attention to how ordinary people respond to this kind of a dominating discourse. And here I come to my last 3 minutes, if I may. Now, if there was a sequel to this book, then what I would like to see in that sequel is even sort of slightly more radical, critical civilizational studies that take this direction that Marlene and Henry Hale, if I understand them correctly, are sort of advancing. And I would like to sort of look at these, well, let's say, if you look at these civilizational discourses, we've tried to describe it, Cora and I, in the introduction. So, you know, this civilizational imagery tends to exclude women, minorities. So what I see a need for feminist critique, perhaps post-colonial critique. And when I say post-colonial critique, I mean inside Russian. I don't mean Russia as the sort of West's other, as you know, I mean inside Russia. This was called colonial critique and Marxist critique, perhaps. And also what I would find interesting to look at is just kind of a popular cultural production and how, you know, the people play with the concept of civilization, how you know, satirical production about civilization. So in general, this kind of a subversive approaches to civilizational discourse would be interesting to look at. And actually there are a few chapters in our book. Tatiana Ryabova looks at popular culture and the sort of from a gender perspective, talks about masculinity, and there is that kind of parodic, satirical aspect there. Galina Zvereva looks at regional civilizational discourses, which I find very interesting. That could be developed into this kind of post-colonial thing. Masha Engström looks at, excuse me, not popular culture, but high cultural production. And I'm not sure if Masha is with us, but maybe she can then comment on this. But that direction could be developed. And then Vesa Oittinen's chapter is very, very interesting. It just gives us, you know, a knowledge about something I presume very few people would actually know about, how the Soviet Marxist thinkers were trying to rethink civilization and fit it into Soviet Marxism. But yeah, so I think there are a lot of avenues to go and to explore in what I would sort of, I don't know, call critical civilizational studies, perhaps. And I would like to see this book presenting that. And here I end. Thank you very much for your attention. And I give the virtual floor to Cora Johan.
Thanks. I'll go on then for another 5 minutes as one of the editors of the book. By the way, the seminar was in 2016. What I would like to do here now is to, as an introduction then, is to provide an outline of a narrative of civilizationism in Russia, as it can be synthesized from the contributions to our book, but above all, as me and Sanna, describe it in our introduction as a kind of attempt to perform a critical study of civilizationism. This narrative that I present focuses on the concept, though it is also possible to speak of civilizational thinking in a broader sense, have a broader perspective on it, and also talk about civilizational talk, as Olga does in her chapters. I assume that she will return to this, but we can also limit it to the concept as we do in the introduction. If you take a broader perspective, I think that classical Eurasianism would clearly be a case in point of civilizational thinking, but though they didn't use the concept so much. But anyway, if we look at the concept, the origins of civilizational the concept then in Russia goes back to the 19th century and to classical Slavophilism, who talked about Russian prasveshenie as being different from the Western one, and prasveshenie corresponded to the French civilisation then. But then later came Danilevsky, who is the kind of pivotal figure in 19th century civilizational discourse in Russia. In contrast to the Slavophiles, who talked about this Russian civilization as a thing of the past, pre-Petrine Russia, Danilevsky thought of it as a project for the future, something that didn't yet exist, but it was about to evolve at that time. So it didn't yet exist. If we go to the 20th century, then civilization was clearly not part of Soviet ideology or rhetoric. If it was as a Western bourgeois concept. So it was not part of Soviet thinking, at least not until the 1980s, when it was introduced as a supplement to the Marxist categories. And this is what Vesa Oitinen describes in this chapter that also Sanna mentioned. But it kind of prepared the way for this civilizational approach that became so popular in the 1990s. So if we go to post-Soviet Russia, then a civilizational perspective on Russia, which was not the critical perspective, was proposed and advanced in several places, several actors, and in several fields. One well-known venue for that was this cultural studies called Kulturologia that replaced materialism, Marxism, Leninism in Russian academia, which promoted this civilizational approach as an alternative to the materialist Marxist approach. And it introduced Spengler and Toynbee as pertinent frameworks and made them very popular in Russia. The popularity of Spengler had other reasons as well. We mentioned Sergei Averintsev, who introduced it to a late Soviet audience, but still, so this culturology was an important venue. Another venue was the Russian Orthodox Church, who used the notion to, well, in various ways, to refer to a spiritual domain as opposed to the materialists, to the matter, but also as referring to the Orthodox world in a broad sense, and also the Russian Orthodox world as stretching beyond Russia's border, so the Moscow Patriarchate. There were politicians and public intellectuals who talked about civilization, and that means the oppositional figures, often with a critical stance towards the Yeltsin regime, and also often of an anti-Western bent, most importantly perhaps Gennady Zyuganov, but also often radical right-wing thinkers such as Oleg Platonov and Yevgeny Troitsky. So people of the fringes. And also neo-Eurasianism belongs to that picture. Very important figure was Alexander Pandarin, who was very important in formulating this civilizational paradigm as an alternative to globalization and as a resistance to Westernism. But then civilizational thinking became part of the critique of globalization in Russia by the late 1990s. Also among younger thinkers, there were some important voices, most notably the young conservatives, Mezuyev, Remisov. So summing up then, by 2010, one could speak of a civilizational nationalism in Russia, as did the two scholars Emil Pine and Alexander Verkhovsky in a seminal article that was published that year, 2010, on civilizational nationalism. And that was just before this became kind of part of the official rhetoric of the Kremlin. In 2012, Putin wrote this famous article about the national question where he described Russia as a state civilization. So by 2012 and Putin's third term, this has kind of become the part of the official rhetoric among the people in power. Well, did Putin and the Kremlin become civilizationalists? I guess Victor will talk more about this later on, but the concept figures there. It figures infrequently, inconsistently, but still so. And most importantly, perhaps, it informs cultural policy and foreign policy concepts. Sanna mentioned this briefly. I think a concept that sums this very neatly is, it was Boris Kapustin, the Russian political philosopher. He speaks of a big discourse made up of civil society, different voices, a big discourse that shapes the small discourse of politics and influences it. So I think that was what happened when, by 2012, the big discourse shaping the small discourse of politics. And what I think has happened the last decade then is that this small discourse of politics kind of returns to various segments of society. People who are supporting the regime or trying to be opportunistic, try to respond to the Kremlin and advancing new civilizational projects. I have studied this phenomenon in academia, where new research projects on Russia as a state civilization has emerged, for instance, within the Academy of Sciences. Yes, so the official term to civilizationalism, however inconsistent, did sanction the civilizational discourse that was already pervasive, but it also elicited a new turn and a new return to civilizationism in many areas. And this is the last phase of this story, as I see it, and we see it in the book. But the book tries to give an overview of both the early stages of the story and the last decade. I think I'll stop there and pass the floor on.
Thank you, Sana and Kore. So I'll pass the floor to Mark. Mark, you're muted. You need to unmute.
Okay. Better?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much to Matthew for organizing this. Let me repeat that, and to the people who put this remarkable book together, because that's an extraordinary achievement. I'm just going to make a few kind of scattered comments. I'm going to remain fairly kind of broad scale, not get into the detail. We can already hear how the editors are kind of getting very specific and technical about the book, and this will be, I'm sure, even more so when the authors start talking about their chapters. I'm going to try to just talk about some things that have struck me. And the first comment I want to make is that, and it's already been made, but let me emphasize it again, that the civilizationism in Russia that this book is about is very much part of a broader phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that's not a phenomenon of the 2000s. It began already in the 1990s. Sana mentioned this Huntington's baggage, yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, okay, you know, Huntington, but I mean, I always think back, and reading this book has made me once again think back with a kind of an astonishment at how, in some ways, insightful for all of the mistakes and kind of bad analysis and unacceptable aspects of Huntington's book, how he remarkably captured a kind of zeitgeist. And he wrote this was in 1990. This was not sort of with a lot of experience of what the post kind of communist world would look like. It hadn't even begun yet, actually, when he first began to formulate this. The book was published later, but I mean, his first articles on this came really right about 1990. And it's just something I kind of think about and think that it's baggage, but it's still there. And this Huntingtonian perspective is still very much a part of what we're talking about. I'll come back to Huntington a little bit later in my comments. My own work now is actually looking also at civilizationism, although well, it's one of the great regrets of my life that I didn't respond positively when I was invited to be part of this extraordinary project that Sana has done, although it gives me a chance now to comment on it, I suppose. But I mean, when I look at the actual product of the book, I think what a failure it was. I was unable to join at the time. What I'm looking at now actually is not civilizationism in Russia. That remains an interest. I actually do look at that. But my active project now looks at civilizationism in Europe, in Western and in Eastern Europe, which is similar and different. But the similarities is what I want to begin with, and that is that all civilizational discourses, civilizationism as we call it, has one big similarity these days. We were talking about the contemporary examples of this, and that is that traditionally civilization was differentiated from the idea of the nation. It's just logical in what these words mean. These are two different things. They relate to one another, they're relevant, but they're two different things. They're alternate. And here I want to use a term that Olga used in her paper that I thought was extremely successful, this notion of imagined collectivity. I like that formulation very much. With her permission, I'm actually going to start using it, I think, for myself. So you have different sort of versions of these imagined collectivities. With civilizationism, and this I think is a characteristic of what's going on today, these two are combined. These two are simply merged together in a way that had not been the case before. Civilizationism is not an alternative to nationalism. It's rather a subset of nationalism. You can say that civilizationism is a particular form of nationalist discourse. I think that seems to me to make sense, and certainly it seems to me the material of the book very much gives examples of that. Civilizationism has a kind of symbiotic relationship, you might say, with the rest of the discourse. It can serve a vital function, a particular vital function. I think we see this actually in the material of the book. But what comes out of the book, for the most part, of course, is not sort of these similarities. I'm emphasizing this kind of conflation of civilization and nation as a universal aspect of this discourse. But I think we have out of the book more distinctive aspects, distinctive characteristics of civilizationism in Russia. And this is what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. I'm going to riff a little bit just on some of the things that struck me as I went through the different chapters, just to get the conversation going. And I began by pointing out a similarity with Europe, that is this idea of civilizationism of nationalism. But let me then here now move on to a fundamental difference, because this is another thing that struck me very much. And that is that in some cases, and maybe in most cases, civilizationism, if we're thinking kind of universally, civilizationism serves to alter the essential us-them juxtaposition. If we think about nationalism, or our identity as the juxtaposition of us and them, civilizationism really, in most cases, changes the orientation because it changes the nature of that juxtaposition. So, for example, you'll see this right away. If you look at Western Europe, where civilizationism is easily as powerful as it is in Russia, though it goes in different directions, you have a very clear juxtaposition, a very clear difference. With nationalism, you have this traditional notion of nations and European nations. So the French don't like the Germans, the Poles don't like the Germans. You have this is the classic us-them connection in Europe. But when the same nations embrace a civilizationalist discourse, then the notion of the other or the enemy, the opponent, becomes completely different. And what were entities that were sort of othered before now become one of the general parts. So all of the European nations then become one kind of member, all become equal members of the civilizational community, which is then defined in terms of other others. And we all know what they are in terms of today's discourse. We have Islam, of course, as this kind of great replacement theory. You have the EU, you have this liberalizing kind of universalizing tendency within Europe as well. So it completely transforms it. Now, I think that this principle, this juxtaposition, is much less true when you move into what is a very felicitous expression. I think it's the state civilization. Who is this? Who am I thinking of, Matthew? State civilizations?
Yeah, it's one of the popular terms that's used by the Kremlin.
I was trying to think of the fellow. The name escapes me now.
Remesov.
Adrian Pabst, that's the one. Adrian Pabst, I think, is the one. Well, maybe it's international, but in the UK, in any event, in the Anglophonic world, this is Adrian Pabst. And you have much less this notion of changing this juxtaposition of changing us and them really doesn't happen here. So you have Russia, I guess China. I don't know about China, I can't say, but Russia here, you have the this collectivity that we think of as the Russian nation simply becomes identified as a civilization. There is much, or almost that way, to a much greater extent, perhaps not entirely, that's kind of an interesting question, but to a much greater extent, you have a simple kind of transference of this identity, which in a sense simplifies the discourse, because it can deal with familiar and very traditional arrangements, traditional antagonisms, traditional opponents that are simply carried over to the new ideological structure. Now, since the demise of the Soviet Union, there's been a search for terminology, terminology that can capture the nature of Russia as a heterogeneous amalgam, this kind of collection of different peoples and different territories. Used to be called the Soviet Union. How do you identify this now? And a whole range of terms have been suggested for this. They're still with us today. They are based on different criteria. So you have ethno-national criteria, for example, in talking about this. And here what I would point to is this idea of Россия. Россия as a collection of Россияне. That is, Россия as this kind of heterogeneous amalgam of Россияне, a mix, in other words, coherent and harmonious, but nevertheless a mix of different ethnic groups and nationalities. So you have an ethno-national criteria, or you can have statist criteria for trying to define what Russia is. And we all know what these are, this kind of geopolitical basis, the idea of Russia as a strong state, государство, which gives you the principle of государственность, or the principle of Russia as a great power, similar but not entirely identical, держава, with this corresponding notion of great powerness, this untranslatable concept of державность. But then all of a sudden, and this is what the book sort of where it takes its cue, all of a sudden around 2012, we dated 2010, 2012, this concept of civilizationism appears as a new generic category and became very popular. And it embraced at very high levels. In the sense the book gives you is one big document to demonstrate this. Why did civilizationism become so popular at this time? What are the advantages of it? Well, one answer, I think, in the appeal of this is that civilizationism, this discourse of civilizationism, avoids or softens, it doesn't avoid it perhaps, but it softens the traditional hard oppositions. So we have, for example, what I've already just talked about, this notion of state power and geopolitics. These, of course, are hard oppositions. They emphasize territorial differentiation. They emphasize the defense of boundaries, the kind of defense, the jealous defense of sovereignty, and so on. Ethno-national criteria also emphasizes the fact, this fact of difference and separation, ethno-national separation. It can be exclusionist, as in this notion, and this again, I think Olga, or one of the authors, I don't remember which, talked about Russkaya Natsiya and how different this is actually from civilizationism. But even when it's not exclusionist, even when it's inclusionist, and to repeat, this is what the Россия concept was. It was an inclusionist concept, but it was nevertheless built on this idea, this principle of difference that was built into it. You were kind of all together, but based on an acceptance and an acknowledgement of the difference. Civilizationism, it seems to me, kind of going over the book and thinking about it, avoids, it has a certain advantage here because it avoids this assumption of these differences. It seems to be more evenly universalistic. It kind of applies evenly to all of the people that are supposed to be included in it, and it stresses. And this came out in the book. This was emphasized in the book: softer and more attractive factors. So it doesn't emphasize military power, state power. It doesn't emphasize ethnic identity. Rather, it emphasizes what? Culture, social values, religion, traditions, all of which are sort of soft, if I could put it like that, all of which are shared. If you think about it this way, you see how clearly here civilizationism is simply replacing nationalism. It's just using different terms and different concepts, but in a sense, it's making the same claim to a kind of even universal sharing that nationalism. That was always the strength, sort of this power of nationalism, was this appeal to this type of a community. Now, one vital aspect of this softness that I'm talking about in civilizational discourse is this nuance that seems to me to be quite important, a nuance between this us-them function that we have in nationalism. And we have it again, we do not, the civilizationism does not get rid of it. It's also based on an us-them, but it treats it slightly differently. Like all identity discourses, there is an other, but the logic of the concept in civilizationism suggests that the other is not necessarily an opponent or a threat, which I think in other cases, in nationalism, for example, this becomes, this is much less clear. This is a very subtle distinction, but to my mind, it's a very important one. And here we come back to Huntington, because the point becomes quite clear if we think about Huntington and his clash of civilizations. So Huntington talked about the importance of civilizations. We all know, talked to essentialize them. This is what we're going to go back to. This is what human society has always been, based on these civilizations for many for centuries, for millennia. But he said further that their relations were characterized by conflict. This is this whole concept, conflict, clash of civilizations, conflict. Now, this clash of civilizations, this clash idea, this idea of an essentialized hostility, is certainly a part of the civilizational discourses in Russia, but it's not exclusive. It's not the only part. At the same time, the discourse of Russian civilization has an alternative, potentially, as another side to it, an alternative quality that if one talks about clash of civilizations, I will talk about collegiality. A collegiality can also be there between civilizations. And you have this in this very nice word, which I didn't know existed in Russian, because I know it is an English word, but it exists in Russian. But when the civilizational discourse came up, I remember I was at Valdai in the Valdai meetings, and they began to talk about dialogue civilizacji, the dialogue of civilizations. In other words, the collegiality. And this is natural. This is part of what the civilizational concept is. So the difference here, yes.
You have about a minute or two. Yeah.
Oh, for heaven's sake. Okay, let me just finish this point then, and I will maybe I'll just end here then. That's fine. So you had this notion of an other, but one that does not necessarily mean opposition, does not necessarily mean hostility. Indeed, I would say that the civilizational discourse, it can be a powerful vision of coexistence. This becomes a new way of thinking about coexistence. And this seems to me to be actually quite important. And nationalism as such, well, yes, I mean, in a way, you could say nationalism, it's a brotherhood of nations, right? This is from Herder, from the 18th century. We have this is part of this kind of nationalist doctrine, but it gets lost, I think. And when we talk about nationalism, we don't really talk about peaceful coexistence. That's not usually what is thought about, but very much is built into this notion of civilizational dialogue, civilizacji, and among other things, my last point, among other things, I think this is very useful if we leave the realm of culturologia, which is kind of where this whole discussion, where the book is at, where this whole discussion is at. But we look at discourses of foreign relations, for example. The idea of civilization becomes quite useful for packaging a Putinist perspective on international relations. Fits very nicely with this notion of multipolarness, which is something else that I'm working on, which is one of international relations, but that can sit nicely, very nicely on this notion of these essentialized civilizations that all kind of are collegial and work together. Okay, thank you. I have one or two more things, but that's fine. Thank you. Wonderful book. Wonderful book.
Thank you. I would like to ask Sana or Corey if you guys would like to respond to Mark or Mark's comments.
I can say a few words. I can start. Thank you, Mark, for your comments and your praise of the book. I just have a short remark to what you talked about, this civilizational paradigm changing the orientation, this us versus them orientation, if I understood you correctly, and also that the other is no longer necessarily an opponent. I see your point. I think in the Russian case, though, it's only partially the case. The Russia and the West classical topic is still very much there, and there's a lot of clashes also. But what we do see, so it's a new language for an old theme, so to speak, but what we also do see is this broader identification with other state civilizations, China, Japan, Iran, etc. And that is probably something new. But so there is something new here, but there is also a lot of the old heritage or legacies of nationalism, I would say also.
Definitely, excuse me if I can just kind of comment on that. Definitely this idea of the clash is still there. It's very much there. So I completely agree with you, but you have another dimension as well, I think, that that can then serve these other purposes.
Thank you. And Sana, do you have anything to add?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mark. I like this idea or this sort of powerful image of coexistence, but I was going to comment along the same lines as Corey. But I would like to give the floor to the others since I already did my little talk, and maybe we can come back to some of the points that Mark raised. Thank you.
Yes. So I would like to ask if there are any comments from the public. If not, we can proceed to Matthew Blackburn commenting on August chapter.
Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you.
I want to start by saying this chapter was a fascinating overview of how civilization and nation have played out as templates for collective identity projects, for imagining a political community. And as Olga only has 15 pages, but she covers 300 years almost, she can't cover everything, of course, in this chapter, but certainly very important concepts, contexts, and ideas are certainly raised here. And the chapter starts with civilizational talk, betiza and civilizational politics, which are two different things to some extent. One is a set of discourses, which we can all agree, I think, have become quite important, quite dominant. Whether it's translated into civilizational politics, whether we haven't reached this stage yet, is beyond the scope of this chapter that Olga has written. But we might come back to it. But certainly in Olga's chapter, we get the idea that it's a civilizational politics is still blurry and unclear, and it allows a range of actors and organizations, priests, communists, United Russia loyalists, ideologues, public intellectuals can all come together under this one umbrella. And I think that Olga makes a very good point to structure our understanding of this civilizational talk as a double reaction. It's a reaction, first of all, to nationalism. Now, this is slightly contradicting what Mark is saying, and I think we have to have this both sides to hear both sides of the argument. If we look at civilizational talk and civilizationalism as an identity template, as a reaction to nationalism, it's a reaction to Russian nationalism to one extent, which goes on the rise in certain perceptional. Some people have perceived it to have been on the rise by 2010 onwards. But it's also a reaction to non-Russian nationalism, both in the Russian Federation and on the borders of the Russian Federation, the post-Soviet states, who have to some extent built their identity projects on anti-Soviet and sometimes anti-Russian narratives. So that's one part of the reaction. The other part of the reaction is a deteriorating relationship with the West. So I think that that was a good sort of way to structure our understanding of what's going on here. That on the one hand, it's pushing back against what is nationalism as threat to Russian statehood. And it's also a response to geopolitics. It's a response, and it's a form of great power legitimation vis-a-vis the West. And I think that is a very good way to sort of, that came out early in the chapter, and I thought that was a very good point. And I say we are still trying to find out whether or not whether the civilizational talk has gone on to become civilizational politics, which is a social fact which guides and structures social action at national and international levels. That remains a challenge to sort of get to the bottom of that and demonstrate it. But looking at the 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century in this chapter, it was fascinating to have them all together in one place. And certainly one thing we see is, again, different templates of imagining a political community, nation, empire, civilization. They are competing in some senses. They're also overlapping in other senses. In some cases, they mutually reinforce each other. And I think that Olga is correct to be cautious about how strictly we try to separate these out. They can blur together in certain points. One thing that came to my mind looking at all the different historical contexts together in one chapter was the constant powerful challenge that the Western nation state has posed to Russia as a model that Russia cannot copy, but would like to copy in some ways. When we look at the 19th century context, the strong desire to hold the imperial body together and to imagine all its different peoples as are organically united and harmonically living together, and that nationalism and liberalism is coming to tear apart this unity. And I think that it's worth pointing out in the 19th century that nationalism comes as a threat to Russia's existence in two ways. And the first is in the sense of liberal nationalism, transferring sovereignty from czar to people. And secondly, as the anti-Enlightenment romantic nationalism, which encourages each eternal people to find their self-determination. So I thought that reading the chapter, it brought back to my idea that the sense of a historical parallel. Russia has been in this situation before the 1830s, where there is the desire to hold together a geopolitical order that is established in 1815, and rejecting Western liberalism and nationalism at the same time, without rejecting modernization. There's still a desire for modernization. So I think this is the interesting point that I saw, that autocracy, samodержавие, orthodoxy, pravoslavие, nationality, народность. We see some of this again today, combined with a defensive position to hold the fort and stop change to a geopolitical order. So I'll move on quickly then to one thing that Olga didn't have time to comment on in her chapter was what she thought about the nation building project of Tsarist Russia and where it was going before it was brutally interrupted. And this is sometimes we get into hypothetical discussions, where might things have gone and how far. I mean, I know that Alexei Miller makes a lot of interesting points about how far a Bolshaya Ruskaya Natsiya project that would bring Belarusians, Ukrainians, other groups together that's an interesting kind of side point. But coming to the 20th century, of course, the Soviet period, it's worth making the point again that the new Soviet state wanted to transcend both nation and empire and create something based on a completely different identity project, a proletarian identity that did not depend on ethnicity or language. But as Olga immediately pays attention to Eurasianist thinking, she's raising the point that very quickly this very ambitious ideological project started to reduce its ambition, its scope of its ambition, and found itself thinkers starting to reconcile various aspects of Russia's Slavophile messianic element of traditions into this new post-World War reality. And by reconstituting the Russian Empire, the USSR soon found itself under Stalin, behaving in similar ways and experiencing similar sensations to the Tsar's predecessor. And I think that's why it's worth paying attention to Eurasianists. But I think that when I was looking at this part of the chapter, I was very interested. I think that we could probably benefit from more research on USSR's kind of imaginary of being a civilization, a distinct civilization, Soviet civilization. Now, that exact term was not used commonly, but it doesn't mean there wasn't an imaginary, because after all, the whole thing was that Soviet, if I use the term Soviet civilization, the idea is that it will smash apart Western civilization, replace it eventually, and it will pull the wool away from the eyes of the workers and the students of the whole world, and they will see that Western civilization is a lie. It's an exploitative lie. And so in a way that this line of Soviet identity project, I know that Brandenburger has paid a lot of attention to national Bolshevism, but at the same time, in parallel to this, the template of Soviet Union as a civilization that is superior to capitalism, a socialist civilization. I think, although the word is not used, I think that was a very interesting thing that came to my mind. But of course, we have the other side of the coin, which is that USSR became arguably a dysfunctional civilization that was unable to reproduce itself. It was unable to deliver in terms of its modernization project after a certain time. And the fact that project collapsed is an important part of our understanding of how civilizational talk re-emerged in 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it's one of the interesting points that came to my mind when I was looking at this part of the chapter. The post-Soviet phase, I think I would add an extra point to this, that the end of the Cold War simultaneously was a time when the nation state and nationalism started to have a rebirth and a proliferation of nationalistic activity, which caught a lot of people by surprise after the end of the Cold War. Simultaneously, it was considered to be a period, the post-Cold War period was simultaneously expected by large numbers of thinkers to become a phase when the nation state would fade out and become less relevant. And we'd enter an age where globalization and international organizations would be more dominant. So in this context, an alternative to the nation state has emerged. You might call it the global liberal project. And in some time, and this is where we come back to Huntington, that he didn't make this prediction exactly, but he suggested there would be an illiberal alternative to the nation state. There's the liberal alternative, which involves globalization and coming together, but there's the illiberal alternative, which is civilization state. A union of peoples that transcends the parochial nation state, but doesn't desire to have a unipolar world, a monoculture. It wants to separate the world up into different civilization states. And that these civilizations learn to cooperate and in so many cases to divide the world up between themselves, but there is no single power. There is no single center of power. There is no single dollar economy, for example. So anyway, I thought that in this chapter, there's a lot of food for thought, and the blurring of the two templates, nation and civilization, is a key theme that I would mark out. We can't expect it to be clear-cut and neat. But one more aspect of the post-Soviet situation is that in the 1990s, the nation-building recipe that was exported to the post-Soviet space was rather simplistic. It was a binary solution. We have civic ethnic building, and we have civic nation building and ethnic nation building. One is bad and one is good. One will lead to democracy and progress. One will lead to violence, hate, and war. And of course, the whole thing that's going on with the civilizationalism project right now is to reject both templates. So Russia sees ethnic nation-state model and the civic nation-state model as possibly equally problematic. That's not something, I don't know if Olga would agree with that, but the whole point of the civilization state project is that you can leave both behind. Both of these recipes, this binary can be left behind. And so it's a way out. I think that Mark has kind of hinted at this too, that having the civilizational politics is a way out of some very difficult discussion. So if you were to look at nationalists, socialists, liberals, conservatives in Russia and bring them all together to one table and ask them to describe what their vision of the Russian nation is, and, or perhaps what it should be, I think you could imagine a very vigorous debate and some very different visions clashing with each other. And I think that one of just the final point I would make, and I think Olga does make this in the chapters, that this civilizational politics, it does bring together some coherent actors together under one umbrella. And when we have words like civilizational state, multi-ethnic people, Russian people, all thrown together in the same sets of statements about what is Russia as a nation, these terms don't need to be unpacked or defined in civilizational talk. And they're not necessarily leading us towards a consistent and clear ideological posture. This is the key question that Olga points towards, Marlene Lorraine, and this idea of ideological posture. So that I would suggest that it's not an ideology, but it's a posture that a number of different a plurality of actors can join and come under this ideological posture without it actually being fully explained or elaborated upon to become an ideology that can be understood very clearly. So yes, a fascinating chapter, and raised a number of questions. I really enjoyed reading it, and I just want to finish by saying that right now the civilizational politics, I was just under this, and the overlap I found when I was reading the chapter was the concept of illiberalism, and this is a kind of a concept which I think has an uneasy relationship with civilizationalism. There's an overlap here as well that we have to, I think it's worth contextualizing civilizational talk and civilizational politics within the context of the global illiberal turn, and trying to conceptualize this as well is quite a challenge. But fascinating chapter, and I will finish my comments here.
Thank you, Matthew. I would like to give the floor to Olga to respond to Matthew, and we also have a very good question on the chat towards all the presenters. So the question is, do presenters are sure that civilization is purely social construction? It means the subjective construction without any real component. That's a question from Marius Vedruzhin. So Olga, the floor is yours to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing this seminar, and thank you, Matthew, for a very nice introduction of my chapter. I agree with practically all you have said. What I would like to emphasize in my own intervention is probably, for me, and what I try to write about in my chapter, it's important that this unmade choice between two templates, civilization or nation, as a mode of imagination of the community that stands behind the Russian state. For me, it's a real challenge, meaning that it is not just a coincidence that Russian elite and Russian society cannot make this choice. I agree with the presentation of Mark Bassin, who brilliantly demonstrated that the idea of civilization and constructing Russian identity according to the civilizational template is very functional in terms of politics. It helps to solve a lot of problems, starting with managing a real heterogeneity of the ethnic, religious, whatever, heterogeneity of the Russian society, and representing it as civilization, and ending with geopolitical vision. And I agree that civilizationalism fits perfectly to to a geopolitical vision of Putin as it is now. I mean, of Putin's elite as it is now. However, what I'd like to emphasize is the fact that this choice is very difficult because Russia, it's difficult for Russia to fit to neither template. It's not only difficult to fit to the template of nation, it's also very difficult to fit to the template of civilization. Even if we bear in mind that, of course, the idea of civilization is rather weak and it evolved a lot, still it has to do with large communities that were created by some large religious or later ideological projects. I found very important the idea of Vadim Tsimbursky, who wrote that the idea of civilization supposes the community that has very specific structure. The structure differs a lot from the structure of the idea of nation. The idea of nation suggests that we have the community of in a sense, equal members of the nation, and they compose a community that has clear borders. I agree with Mark, there is a clear border between us and them, often based on ethno-nationalist assumptions. However, in the case of civilization, there is another idea. There is the idea of the center and periphery, and periphery is potentially boundless, meaning that the community that composes the center of the civilization is represented as bearer of some specific ideas and cultural values that are important for whole humankind. That is a kind of the transcendental destination of mankind. But it is these specific people, this specific community that develops these values and brings it to other parts of mankind. So the idea of Vadim Tsimbursky is that to have a civilization, to construct your community according to this template, you need to have something to pretend to be what he calls the sacred vertical, meaning you need to have some reasons to pretend that you actually develop these specific ideas and cultural practices that match the transcendental destination of mankind. And it looks like it always was difficult for Russian elites to manage this. I tried to demonstrate in my book that, for example, in the 19th century, the idea of Russia as civilization was not really powerful, and of course it was something like this was articulated by Danilevsky or some other people, but it was marginal in the discourse of the Russian cultural elite. It was rather marginal at that time, and it looks like it was only after the revolution of 1917 that some reasons for imagining Russia as some place where important ideas and human practices, ideas and practices important for the whole human mankind are developed. And of course, on the one hand, we have the Bolsheviks project, and on the other hand, we have the Eurasianist project, which, of course, rather contradictory as soon as it looks like for them, if we take classical Eurasianists, still the cultural vertical was based on some religious ideas, and it has to do with real heterogeneity of Russia. However, it looks like to develop itself according to the civilizational template, Russia should really divorce with the West, really divorce with the Europe meant as the West, and to be able to demonstrate that the values that Russia develops somehow are contrasted to those of the Western values. And for many reasons, it was very difficult for Russian elites and for Russian leaders. Probably right now, where as soon as we see how confrontation between Russia and the West gets new scale of becomes more and more intensive and extensive. Sometimes you have feeling that yes, now they are ready to say that they are quite different, and of course, if you listen to contemporary Russian propaganda, it is there. Still, however, I think that a large part of Russian people and a large part of a cultural elite would disagree with it. I did the research, of course, it was early, it was in soon after annexation of Crimea, it was 2014, 2015. I tried to look at how in the political discourses Chinese and American other are used. And I found that the pivot to the East for this moment was not supported by a real readiness to see China as a cultural, as cultural model and as full-fledged external other. And of course, the US is still very important other. It means that mentally and culturally, probably it will be still very difficult to realize this idea of civilizational thinking in full
Olga?
Yes, I'm finishing.
Yeah.
Even if politically it becomes functional and it fits nicely to what Russian political elites does nowadays. I shall stop here and thank you again for this discussion, and thank you, Matthew, for very nice introduction of my chapter.
Thank you very much. We're running a bit late, so I would like to give the floor to Alicia, commenting on Victor's chapter, and then we'll take all the questions after.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Let me just say that I was really happy to be able to read the whole volume and to comment today on it. I think it's a very needed contribution. It really helps us to bring order in the ongoing debate on Russian civilizational discourse. It shows this complex phenomenon from different angles. It really brings a lot of context, and I guess what's the most important thing for academia is it raises new questions, and this is really valuable, right? And if I were to point to one common denominator for all the chapter, most or all the chapters of the volume, I would say that this is the imperial legacy. How the civilization discourse is connected to imperial legacy. And within this imperial legacy, there is the motive of post-Soviet heritage legacy, the roots of civilizational discourse in Soviet times and not only. Also anti-Westernism, which is also a part of how to deal with, or I mean, it's rooted in the imperial past, and of course it's still here. And the third motive, which features most of the chapters, is also how Russian civilizational discourse plays into new Russian conservatism. So the three elements, so imperial legacy, anti-Westernism, and new Russian conservatism, they are really in most, if not in all of those chapters. And all these three motives we will find in Professor Schnillerman's great chapter. And it starts with a daring thesis that in fact civilizational discourse was an ideological replacement of Marxism-Leninism in the 90s. There was a void which was filled by the discourse of civilization. Then we get a great overview of how the discourse was developing, why, how, the main entrepreneurs, what was the dynamic of the discourse, and later the very rich empirical material with the main two characters. This is Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill. Why? Because as Professor Schnirelman noticed, there are two currents in which the civilizational discourse has been developing in Russia. One is academic, and the other one is national patriotic, and the latter is on which Professor focused in his chapter. So national patriotic, that's why Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill. So we got a lot of material, a lot of quotations, and very sharp conclusion at the end that talking about civilizational turn is in fact not the best, because it's rather temporary and superficial twist and not a civilizational turn. Why? Because Putin is instrumental about civilization and talking about Russia's civilization. So is Patriarch Kirill. And this is very well illustrated by the material which is analyzed in the chapter. So not a conservative, not a civilizational turn, rather a twist. And this is the whole discourse is an instrument of Russian political elites. I mean, political and broad Russian elites. Although Patriarch Kirill's status is somewhere very, very, very close to a political elite, I guess. And reading this chapter, I had few questions in my mind. I will try to pose two here, and then if time allows later, maybe I'll bring two more. But before I come to these two questions, I want immediately link it to what Mark Bassin said, right? He said that, in fact, civilizationism, this is a beautiful, I mean, not beautiful wasn't said, but this is a vision. This is a vision of, well, geopolitical order, maybe something more, and it also has advantages. But my question is, if we take Professor Schnirelman's contribution and that he shows that this is really an instrument, right? So there is a vision and this is an instrument. So my question would be, what's the goal? What's the goal? And is there any goal? To what purpose this instrument is used? In short term, this we more or less can get from the chapters, right? To consolidate the multi-ethnic population in Russia and to stand against the West. It's about keeping major power state or signaling this ambition and so on and so forth. But what about the long term? Is it any goal in the long term for using this kind of instrument? If we take point made by Professor Schnirelman. And now my two questions. One is something would already also Matthew noticed, right? This Soviet past, right? So how much the Soviet past is relevant for making this discourse attractive today in Russia for the Russian audience? Because in Professor Schnirelman's chapter, we can also get sociological polls, surveys, right? How people in Russia react to this. So how much the Soviet past, and by Soviet past, I mean even just Soviet socialization, Soviet imaginary. This is what Matthew said. Maybe the word wasn't used, Soviet civilization, right? But the imaginary was there. So how much this, in a way, recent past is relevant for the discourse, how it's developing in Russia and how it's being used by the elite. Because the fact that Vladimir Putin is instrumental about it, and so as Patriarch is, can be in any way connected to their Soviet socialization, right? I mean, I'm just putting this in this way, like they both were connected one way or another to KGB institution, right? In different capacities maybe, but even this kind of socialization, could it have any impact or why they embrace this discourse, they proceed, or is it irrelevant? So in general, the question about the Soviet past, how much it can help us to understand today's dynamics of this discourse. Also taking into consideration points made by Vesa Oitnen, this great chapter, right? So how much it's about the Soviet past here? And the second question, And I think it's even bigger than the Soviet past, but it also includes this. Because we have a sentence in the chapter which says, civilization is a code word for an empire. In fact, civilization, the whole discourse, is a substitute for an empire. And as I said, if you go for the chapters of all the contributors, the empire word is in every one of them. You can get in Professor Smalinova rehabilitation of the imperial legacy. Then you go Vesel Oltin, of course, Soviet roots, and so the Soviet Empire. Galina Zvereva writes about empire and how it's connected to anti-Westernism. Martha Engstrom has post-imperial melancholy, right? And my question is like this. So if it's in fact a substitute for an empire, my question is, do we need still this code word? Do we need this substitute? Can you imagine that there is any group in Russia today who would be ready to support and embrace just empire without looking for code words, that you wouldn't have to code it, just, it's an empire, and why should we be shy about it? And I'll ask why I'm posing this question this way, because I recall conversation with Alexei Levinson, who was talking about another taboo, because this empire word, right? It's a kind of taboo, right? It's something bad, negative association. So we don't talk about empire, right? We talk about civilization. And Alexei Levinson said something in this way about another taboo, which is war. That until annexation of Crimea, war was really a taboo. I mean, a taboo and something really horrifying for most of Russian society, right? Whatever happens, we don't want to have another war. But after annexation of Crimea, the certain kind of understanding appeared in a certain part of Russian society that, okay, if annexation of Crimea, which was done in this kind of akkuratna way, if this is a way a modern war can look like, then maybe we are ready. If you can do it in this technological way with no victims, then why not? And he made the conclusion that this taboo, which was there for a long time in Russia about war, and do whatever it takes but no war, has been undermined by annexation of Crimea. So this, and I'm finishing here. So how about empire? Can you imagine that this taboo would be also broken or be changed in a way in Russian society and of course Russian elites as well? And really, thank you to all contributors for this book. I agree with everything that has been said here, that it's really needed and an excellent contribution. And thank you for Professor Schneiderman for his chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. And I would like to invite Victor. The digital floor is yours to respond to Alicia.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Alicia. For your interesting coverage of my chapter and for your, well, not so easy questions. I'll try to answer, but I'll start from quite another points, I guess. Actually, I feel somewhat confused and it's really bizarre for me to participate in a discussion where people seriously talk about civilization, because for me it's really a very artificial construction, and well, my point is very critical, but I would say that there are not many. I would say there are only a few scholars in Russia who criticize this so-called civilization approach, and people who are very sympathetic to this approach, they don't refer to my publications, or they just ignore. I would like them to argue with me, but they don't. Well, everything is published in Russian, and there are, from my side, from my view, good arguments, but I would like them to explore these arguments, and if they know something else, and if they can argue, I'd love them to argue, but they just ignore, and so I would say that what is important in this discourse, civilization discourse, is not the meaning of civilization, but a usage of civilization, a usage of this knowledge, how it is used, in what context it's used, what are the results of this usage, right? Because in the lips of those who are talking, I mean politicians primarily, who are talking about civilization, it's a very obscure, it's very controversial concept, dealing with everything. If we talk about borders, where are the borders of civilization? If we talk about culture, what is the culture of civilization? When we talk about religion, how religion fits with this concept, you know, and there are no good answers actually. For example, if we take what I call classical Eurasianism of the 20s, then there were also discussions. For example, for Karsavin, religion was the basis of civilization. For Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, it was culture, it was languages and cultures, not religion. And there were very interesting discussions in the 20s. What I'd like to emphasize once again, you know, there was a very interesting dynamic, because there were scholars, primarily historians, who developed this so-called civilization discourse in the 80s, 1980s, right? Then in 1990s, the discourse was picked up by Russian nationalists, primarily Dugin and some other guys. And at that time, they were pretty marginal. And then in the early 21st century, the discourse was picked up by the politicians. So there was a dynamic, you know, a very interesting dynamic. And it was borrowed and picked up just to present Russian, so-called Russian civilization as being based on conservative values.
Victor, we have
just probably 2 minutes.
Go ahead.
Just back to your question, Alisa, about who is interested in imperial approach. Are there anybody? You know that Chubais talked in 2004, I guess, talked about liberal empire. And that was from the liberal side, but from the right-wing side, there are many people. And now one more point. I can't understand why Mikhail Remezov is called here as an inventor of the term state civilization. A problem is that in the very early 2000, a whole group of Russian nationalists were developing an idea of Russia as civilization. And there were many people, about 24 people, including Dugin, Holmogorov, Kalashnikov, and many, many others. And in 2005, they published their book, which was called Russian Doctrine, Русская доктрина. Big volume, you know, more than 1,000 pages. It's not easy to read it, but
I have it at home, I know.
good, and it's heavy. It's heavy for you, especially, you know, young woman. It's heavy to bring it at home. At that time, Surkov, who was in contact with these guys, he picked up some ideas. And probably the last point, very interesting, I think, about ideology or ideas which I ascribe to Putin. I'm not sure that he has any ideas. He has aides, he had assistants, and he has what we call political technologists, who are pretty sophisticated. And also we have think tank organizations, like, for example, RISI, Russian Institute for Strategic, what? Initiative? Or what? For Strategic Studies, right. And some other agencies who provide Kremlin administration with analysis of not only what's going in Russia, but abroad as well. So, and I guess that's why, you know, we have fluctuations, you know. First, an emphasis on civilization, then a shift to some other paradigm, and about you know, I can't stop because it's
yes, because we have a lot of interesting questions on the chat.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Probably the last point, because for about 25 years I study history textbooks, which I used in school. And what is interesting is that they introduced an idea of civilization just in the very late 90s and very early 2000s. But then this idea almost disappeared from there. And just in a month, one paper of mine article of mine will be published in Italy in English, just about this, about new school textbooks and about idea of civilization there, and so on and so forth. So there is a very interesting dynamic. And when we discuss this problem of civilization, we have to make difference between political discussion, political discourse, educational discourse, scholarly discourse, I would say nationalist discourse, and so on and so forth. Well, I can add many other interesting things, but I guess that I took too much time already. So thank you.
Thank you, Victor. So I would like to start with the questions. I will really ask for like shorter answers because we have quite a lot of questions. So do you agree that civilization is purely socially constructed? And I would add one question from myself. You discussed the discursive element of civilization, but there's more and more talk about the material components. So what are the material components towards civilization? And I would like to also add one additional question. What are the factors which define are defining for civilization? Are they language, religion, a particular location, economic unity? And could you please elaborate more on that? Thank you.
Can I start?
Whom do you ask?
Go ahead, Olga, and then
No, Sana.
Sana.
Me? Okay, I'm not even pretending to give an answer to all those questions, but I think even that these questions are made actually address the very problem that we're talking about. And how to start? Actually, in the introduction, Kore and I address civilization from the viewpoint of a discursive construct. So there's one way to go about it, but I do think that the problem with civilization is the same to an extent as with empire. It's super blurry. It's very hard to define. Okay, it has to do, if you look at dictionaries, it has to do with human social development or human social organization. And in this book, we have one contribution, which is by Mikhail Maslovsky, which addresses civilization or uses civilization as an analytical category. But I think, personally, I think, with all due respect to Mikhail and that wonderful sociological theory that he presents to us in this chapter, I do think that here, and here I come back to empire, that these two concepts, empire and civilization, and I think it's Ronald Sunni that talks about this, about when he talks about empire, is that it has great symbolic power. It's a great metaphor, but it can mean almost anything. And it's the same with, well, not almost anything, but it's hard to define as an analytical category, and it's hard to use as an analytical category. It's some sort of a state formation. And it's the same with civilization. It is a wonderful metaphor, and the connotations have to do with culture, tradition, social values, stuff that Mark was talking about. And it's exactly for that reason, as Mark was saying, I think that's what he was saying, that it is so useful. And it does have this, the powerful image of coexistence. I love that. Although I have to say that if the idea was to, if the intention was to sell this idea when it came about as in the use of Russian state actors, if the idea was to sell the idea, if they wanted to sell the idea of Russia as a civilization as a sort of a foreign policy instrument for, people outside Russia, I don't think they succeeded too well, particularly with this, we come here as a civilization, we're friendly, we're not an empire, hostile. But I don't think they were very successful. But I do think that the idea was to sell it to domestic public. And there, I think they have been quite successful, in my opinion. Although I would like to see more research. I come back to one of my initial points on this sort of subversive use of civilization in Russia. But I do think, and this is one of the points we end up with, Kore, we end up the introduction that, it's exactly for this sort of positively high-minded, lofty and historically affirmative meanings that the concept of civilization has, that the Russian state actors have been able to capitalize on this term, on this concept, and to sell Russia as civilization to voters, to gain public support. So there are so many interesting points that we could continue, and I really liked what Victor was saying about these different levels of the discourse too, where the civilization is used and so on. But yes, so I don't know if this really directly answered any of the questions, but I just wanted to, to think around them. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Olga, and then Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to answer these questions in my way. I think that, yes, of course, civilization is a discursive construction. However, to have this discursive construction successful, to have it trustful, you need some material conditions, of course. On one hand, we can say that civilization has some affinity and clear affinity to empires. And of course, it's empire as a political project, empire that builds some political and social cultural basis for civilization. So typically, we see this pretense for civilization where we see empires. Not every empire becomes civilization, but there is no civilizational projects without empires. And second thing I'd like to emphasize, what is important about empire is that the criteria of belonging is not language or something that is typically peculiar for nation. I think that idea of Vadim Tsimbursky about the sacred vertical is very important. You can pretend to be an empire if you can to present some cultural practices or some ideas that are essential for the whole humankind, and you can represent your own community as a center for these ideas. The model of civilization is very, how to say, it has no borders, but it has a structure of center and boundless periphery, meaning that center is some community that is united by these specific, very important for the whole humankind, cultural practices and ideas. And in material world, you not always find conditions to make this pretense trustful. Also because typically the cultural practices and the shared ideas are rather various. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yes, I'll just respond to the question of how do we define civilizationalism? What kind of criteria can we use? I'm not too sure if that is the most productive way to start with the kind of finding the answers, because it is so diverse, the different visions that sit along one side one other within a civilizational imaginary. And so yeah, I think looking for like the hard lines of it is pretty difficult. But when it comes to, I would build on what Victor said about civilizational talk feeling like it's a very shiny macro discourse that covers an essential nakedness. And the essential nakedness is, well, what is Russian exceptionalism? Can we unpack it? And can we say, what does Russia have to offer to the rest of the world that they can learn from it? It's a difficult question. And we're not living in a time in Russia today when this debate is extremely lively and involving lots of different sides, and we're having big debates about Russia as a civilization, as Victor points out. It's not really in the political campaigning, it's not really on the TV shows. It kind of seems to be like an endpoint of 30 years of different arguments and debates, and it's kind of settled on this as a kind of way of ending the conversation temporarily. We use this civilizational discourse, we agree that the sort of certain actors have agreed and come to a consensus on this. But when it comes to the relationship between civilization and empire, and is this a substitute for empire? I think it's a very interesting question, and we all have to think about it very carefully. Going back to the 19th century, empires were legitimate, and the relationship between modernity, civilization, and empire was quite clear. And some of the advanced civilized powers had responsibilities to modernize and grow and develop the uncivilized parts of the world. And this legitimacy of the empire continued all the way through into the 20th century. It started to break down. So to talk about today civilizationalism as a replacement for empire or imperialism, I think is a little bit, I'm not too convinced about that, because I think it's a different situation. And I think we have to go back to the language of the people who use civilizational talk and see it in their terms. And if you see it in their terms, if you look at some key Kremlin actors and some of the most prominent kind of civilizational actors and what they say, they'll say that what happened at the end of the Soviet Union was a large informational campaign was launched to discredit and delegitimize the Soviet state. And it was combined with hybrid warfare, and it was extremely successful, and the Soviet state collapsed to the benefit of the Western geopolitical actors. And the worst thing that could happen to us all today is for that to be repeated. And they are trying to repeat it again with their propaganda against Russia and so on. I'm using their words and using their terms, and I'm trying to access their imaginary. And if you see it from their point of view, it's not an imperial project. It's a defensive project, which is designed to avoid collapse and fragmentation. And they entirely see that's one of the important instrumental aspects of civilizational talk. It's a unifying umbrella to keep everyone in the same camp. And it's several steps short of a tight, tough ideological regime. It's not quite the same as that. It's more fluid and flexible than that and allows more plurality. But still, I think it's an interesting question. We keep coming back to empire, and that's what I would say about it.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in?
Very quickly, Alicia, so we can have time for some more questions.
Sure. No, where Matthew just stopped, the empire, that's something from the past, and now we have to be careful how to use it. But I think, and if I'm not correct, Professor Schirman, please correct me, that empire in this way, that's not as an aggressive political entity which is proceeding with an imperial policy. Not in this sense. Empire as a great major geopolitical player. I think this is rather the context in which we can see it as this kind of ideological replacement, that the great Russia, it used to be a Roman Empire, Soviet Empire, and now, well, empire doesn't sound that well, civilization. If this is not accurate, as I said, it is correct, but I think it's not about being imperial in terms of being an aggressive player, but empire as this major, powerful geopolitical player, not necessarily being aggressive, it can be defensive as well.
I would like to ask two questions that were posted in the chat. So, do we accept a civilization to be constructed from the bottom or from the top? And I would like to add, are there some meso-level organizations, groups, social movements that are contributing actively towards constructing the discourse for civilization? Victor?
Could I?
Yes.
This is just what I wanted to emphasize, actually, and what I wanted to add to this very interesting discussion. Look, what we had in 1980s. Well, I would start from a different point. A civilization is not only about enemies or us, them. It is not only about coalitions or dialogue of civilization. It's also about status. Now, what we had in 1980s, leaders of some minorities in Russia, as for example, northern minorities, they claim status of nation just to upbring their status, their political status. In 1990s, there was a shift. And more fashionable became claim of civilization status. So not only Russians, not only Russian politicians, but in the regions, politicians of various ethnic origins claimed civilization status. And what we had, it was a very bizarre pattern. When, for example, side by side with so-called Orthodox civilization or Eurasian civilization, we had Arctic civilization, we had Tatar civilization, we had Muslim civilization, we had North Caucasian civilization, we had Adiga civilization, Bashkir civilization, and so on and so forth. and they just overlapped. They crossed borders because, for example, if religion is a basis of civilization, then what to do with, where are the borders between so-called Orthodox civilization and Muslim civilization, right? They overlap. And you know, the situation is very complicated and very, very controversial. So what I mean is that the civilization paradigm was developed not only in the center, not only in Moscow, not only in the Kremlin. It was also developed in the what we call ethnic areas, ethnic regions, or ethnic republics. So this is part of the answers for these very important questions, actually.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to elaborate more on the question from our speakers? The question is, do we accept a civilization to be constructed from bottom or from top? Are there some meso-level organizations, movements, or groups who are major in promoting this discourse?
Well, very briefly, I can make a response to that. I think we should expect it to be co-constructed so that it is a resonating process whereby the discourses that are pushed on from above, there's a sense of resonance that occurs with everyday people's lives, and that these grassroots mid-level organizations come up and they do the work in specific constituencies and communities to make it work. And I think that if you look, that's where the research agenda could go next, and that's where we don't have the answers for. But it doesn't, I would say that it should be co-constructed if it's going to have a future. If it's not co-constructed and it's mainly just from above, pushed from above, then it doesn't have a future. It won't be vital enough. Yeltsin had a top-down project for his vision of Russia, and it didn't resonate, and it disappeared to some extent. It faded away the minute he left office. So that's the sort of thing we don't know yet. We don't have a crystal ball, and it is very difficult to measure the resonance of a project like this. But I think co-construction is a good concept to use to see the overall vitality of a project like this.
Just to add something to this, you know, what is important is that that state in this particular pattern, state is much stronger than, you know, all these movements from the grassroots. There are, of course, there are ideas from the grassroots and from the top and from the bottom and from different sides, actually. But state with its institutions, with its, you know, police, with its army, it's much stronger. And when state is interested in some very important idea, it has implements to oppress all the others. This is a problem.
Thank you. Anyone else, or should I proceed to the next question?
May I just add that I think
Yes.
Matthew's point about co-construction is important, that this was what I tried to illustrate in my short talk initially, that there have been several groups who contributed to this civilizationism in Russia, and perhaps that's an explanation why it has been so successful. It had such an appeal. It came from different segments and then was picked up by the people at the top. So it wasn't perhaps created from the bottom, but at least from the middle, to answer that particular question.
Thank you very much. The next question is, did the concepts of civilization decrease Russia's self-identification as European or part of Europe?
I can respond to that very briefly by pointing to something that Olga wrote. She referred to the idea that also Marlon L'Oreal wrote about. There's three choices for Russia in its civilizational grammar. Russia can be a European country with a Western road of development, following the standards and norms of the West. Russia can be a European country with a non-Western road of development, or Russia can be a non-European country with a completely different story. And it seems like path 2 is the one that has ended up being, it's not been chosen, it has happened this way for a number of different reasons. And if you want to unpack them, you need a whole book, and it would be ideas and institutions and geopolitics interacting to explain how that happened. But once you arrive at that point, that's when there is a, you could say, a force of gravity that's going to pull civilizationalism in to fill the hole, because then you have to legitimize that pathway. You have to come up with a set of ideas and an imaginary that will say, this is why we're going down this road. Why it ended up that way is a very complicated question, but that's my response, is that Russia remains ambivalent towards Europe. It is at the same time part and apart from Europe. And so that's the response to the question I would give.
Thank you, Matthew. Anyone else from the speakers?
Well, just to add something, just look at history of Russia. Russia borrowed secular art from the West, right? Russia borrowed science, basic science, from the West, and it was in 17th and in the 18th centuries. So, and how it could be if there was a closed civilization with you know, unpassable borders. It's, you know.
Thank you. We have one more question from Susanna. Perhaps it's important, it's not what civilization means and how it's used, but rather why it is used. So do we have anyone who would like to comment on that?
Well, I did already in the chat. I think that's that's the important question here, not what it means, but how it is used, and why it is used. And well, imperial legacy was mentioned already by Alicia, and that's one answer to it. It's a positive way of articulating it, not constrained by the burden of empire. So that's one answer to it. And as an alternative also to the nation state, which is not understood as pertinent to the Russian case. That's another. So both an alternative to both nation and empire, perhaps.
Thank you. Anyone else from the speakers who would like to comment on that? Okay, and we have one raised hand from Nelly Kirilova. If you can present yourself and your institutional affiliation, and you can go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm a PhD candidate in international security at the Corvinus University of Budapest, Hungary. So I would like to address the question of Susanna, if possible. She was asking why the civilizations are created and the concept of civilization is created. I think it's not so difficult to answer, because if we accept that the civilization was created from the top, then it was created, this concept, for the purpose of having a unity which is strong and stronger compared to other unities. So it will be the status that Victor mentioned earlier. It will be about the status of this unity. And if the concept is created from the bottom, then it's due to the psychological need of belonging of the people. So they need to be part of something bigger than themselves, a group, and this group to be part of bigger group and bigger. So we go on this if it is from the bottom. And then for me, the bigger question is, if the concept of civilization is created on the same factors for different civilizations, then what is the difference between them? What is the difference between the conceptual construct of Russian civilization, post-Soviet civilization, EU as a civilization, maybe, European, maybe, US, maybe? So what is the difference between these? Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly.
A quick response if others are thinking. First of all, I would push back against seeing it as a concept. It's not really a concept. Concept is something like social mobility is a concept. Civilizational talk is not really a concept. It's not elaborated out very clearly. And so the elaborations that are available, if we look through different texts, the official texts, they don't go too far and too deep into making it kind of a tough kind of set of lines about how things should be. Instead, I think I agree with what you're saying about it solving an identity crisis issue. So it's a way of saying, right, if all these different identity projects don't quite work and don't quite resonate, if the Western liberal project doesn't quite work, or if this one doesn't work, or the ethnic nationalist project, so how about this one? This one holds this kind of thing as a civilizational imaginary. It holds together because it kind of can combine some rather uncombinable things, and somehow it's still coherent for the people that believe in it. So that's how I would respond very quickly, just to allow other people to respond as well.
Thank you, Matthew. Anyone else who'd like to respond to that? Okay, so I think we're running a bit out of time already. So I would like to conclude today's research seminar, and would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution and all the members of the audience for being here with us today. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the week.